Hi boys and girls, it's Mrs. Urbanski. I'm a little late this morning, but I'm going to read the next part of Seaman, the dog who traveled the Oregon Trail with Lewis and Clark. We left off yesterday as Sacagawea was telling her story, so that's where we're going to pick up today. Nobody spoke for a few minutes. Crusat played a slow, lonely song on his fiddle. When the men of the Corps were living at Fort Mandan, the last landmark that the Indians could describe to them was the Three Forks. Now that the expedition has reached Three Forks, the captains were on their own. Nobody had given them any advice about which way to continue traveling west. They didn't know which one of the Three Forks to follow, so they chose the river that curved to the west, since that was the direction of the Pacific Ocean. They named it the Jefferson River in honor of the president. While Clark led the canoe up the river, Lewis led short scouting parties overland to search for Shoshone Indians. He left Seaman with the canoes because the Shoshones might be scared off by the sight of such a big dog. But Lewis' luck was no better than Clark's had been. On August 8th, Sacagawea recognized another landmark, a rise where her people called the Beaver Head. She said this was a near place where the Shoshone lived during the summer months. Now this was encouraging news. Lewis took 2 men and set out to locate the Indians, leaving Seaman with Clark and the others. Canoe travel had become impossibly slow. The Jefferson River was more like a shallow stream than a river. There were frustrating delays when the canoes got stuck on the boulders of tree roots. Seaman splashed along the icy, shallow water as the men strained against the ropes. The group came to the mouth of another stream, and Clark wasn't sure which watery way the Jefferson River. Although they kept expecting to see Lewis or one of his scouts return with some news, days passed with no word. On August 17th, the men were dragging the canoes when Seaman barked and took off with a gallop. A few minutes later, he returned with one of Lewis's scouts and an Indian brave. The Indian was so thin his ribs stuck out. He wore a cloth around his waist and a baggy vest and brightly colored cloth headband. Clark waved. He turned to Sacagawea and asked, "Is the brave one of your people?" Sacagawea smiled and nodded. "He's wearing the clothing of my people." Captain Clark called the scout. "Captain Lewis is in camp with the Shoshone chief. We saw the Indian horse herd. There are about 400 animals." Clark took the explorers to the beach to put the boats there. He ordered some men to guard the supplies and told others to follow him. Taking Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and Seaman, he hurried ahead. As they rounded a bend, Seaman dashed up the banks, barking happily for a minute. Clark saw Lewis waving to them, his face beaming. Seaman bounded to Lewis, wagging his tail. Lewis threw his arms around Seaman, letting the dog cover his face with wet kisses. He buried his hand in Seaman's warm fur and gave a silent prayer of thanks. At last, the Corps of Discovery was together again. They had finally located the Shoshones, and the Indians had plenty of horses to trade. The Indians crowded around, eager to look at the newcomers. Clark ran up to Lewis and held him by the shoulders. "Meriwether, you did it! You found the Shoshone!" "I'm so glad to see you, William. We've been camped here for days waiting." Lewis's words rushed out. "When you didn't come, the Indians started grumbling. They thought I was playing some sort of trick on them. I was afraid they would leave before you arrived with the trade goods." Lewis stroked Seaman's head and told him to sit. "Stay, Seaman," Seaman responded immediately. He sat, his eyes searching Lewis's face. He did not move a muscle except the tip of his tail, which wagged back and forth. When Lewis led Clark to the Shoshone chief, the chief grasped Clark and gave him a full-body hug, a traditional greeting among the Shoshone. His name was Camawat. Camawat's decorated Clark's hair with shells to honor him. The The Indians gathered around to watch, smiling at the explorers. These men were the first people the Shoshone had ever seen who were not Indians. The greetings began, and the explorers found themselves smothered with hugs. Several of the Shoshones marveled at Seaman. They made the sign of a bear and seemed astonished that the big dog would sit so patiently. The Indians said the dog's intelligence was astonishing. The Indians also seemed amazed that a man could have black skin. They eagerly touched the bare skin on York's neck and arm when they hugged him. Suddenly, a woman screamed. Everyone froze, startled. Seaman whooped and sprang to his feet. His eyes scanned the people's faces, searching for danger. One of the Shoshone women clutched Sacagawea, and both began to cry out. The women recognized each other. They had been childhood friends. The two were in the same camping party when the Hidatsa raiders took Sacagawea prisoner. In fact, the woman had inquired her name, Jumping Fish, from the way she had leaped across the stream to escape from the Hidatsa. The explorers watched, astonished, as quiet, calm Sacagawea screamed and danced around, weeping with joy. The two young women hugged, tears streaming down their cheeks. Then they laughed through their tears, grasping each other's shoulders to gaze in wonder into each other's faces. Words tumbled from their mouth. After a few minutes, the women quieted down. Sacagawea slid Pomp off her back and showed him to her friends. Jumping Fish held the baby in her arms and drenched him in teary kisses. Late that afternoon, after the greetings were finished, the captain held a meeting with the Camawat and some of his braves. Sacagawea was the translator, and Seaman sat calmly by her side. The men were deep in their talks when Sacagawea suddenly stopped translating. She leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Camawat. Puzzled, the captain stared at her. Ignoring the awkward silence, Sacagawea called a few words in Shoshone. She jumped up and ran to Chief Camawat. Then she threw her arms around him and held him. Lewis looked at Charbonneau. "What's going on?" he asked. Sacagawea just recognized her brother. That's pretty cool. Astounded, the men stared. Sacagawea called the Shoshone chief his childhood name. Camawat smothered his sister's hair, looking into her eyes, and tenderly held her slender face in his large, weathered hands. Sacagawea unwound the blanket tied around her waist and threw it over their heads so she could weep with Camawat in private. Sobs shook her body, and she held her brother, now a grown man and the leader of the people she had been torn away from as a girl. Oh, okay. So there's a picture. Can you see it? Okay. Let's see what the caption says. The great chief of this nation proved to be the brother of the woman with us and is a man of influence, sense, and sincerity. Journal of Captain William Clark, August 17, 1805. After a while, Sacagawea returned quietly to her seat in the circle. Seaman crept to her side. She laid a hand on the dog's broad back as if to steady herself. The men resumed their talk, and Sacagawea translated. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and several times her face crumpled. She had to pause and hold her hand in front of her eyes, struggling to compose herself. Finally, she nodded at the captains, and the meeting continued. Camawat remained calm, as befitted the leader of his people, but his eyes looked lovingly on this young woman who had been a little girl when they last called each other brother and sister. The Shoshone Indians helped the explorers carry their baggage over the first high pass in the Rockies. Seaman ran alongside the Indians and explorers on the steep trail, wearing his saddlebags packed full of goods. Food was scarce, but the two groups shared what little they had. By August 26th, the work was complete. That night, the explorers held a party in camp to thank the Indians. Cruzet played his fiddle, and the men danced. York danced a jig, and the Indians called out their appreciation for his nimble feat. It was a merry evening, but the leaders of both groups were nervous. Early that morning, there had been frost. The Shoshones were eager to reach the buffalo hunting grounds on the plains to lay in and store meat for the winter. Without this food supply, their band would starve in the coming months. The explorers had to get enough horses to carry them across the mountains before the snows came, or their group would also starve to death. Over the next few days, horse trading occupied most of the leaders' time. Seamen sat near the captains as they haggled for horses. At first, bargaining was easy. The Indians were delighted to trade such a common item as a horse for novelties like cloth shirts or mirrors. But soon the Indians realized the explorers were desperate to acquire horses and would pay whatever they could. In just a few days, the price of Shoshone horses greatly increased. The explorers bargained away some of their dearest possessions, knives, guns, and ammunition. In the end, they got their horses, 29 of them, but the animals did not come cheaply. It was not the Shoshone custom to travel west towards the Pacific Ocean, but one older man in their band, Old Toby, had made the journey years ago. He knew the way through the mountains, and he agreed to guide the expedition. Both the Indians and the explorers were keenly aware that winter was closing in. It was critical to be on their separate ways. For Sacagawea, this was a painful thought. She had been torn away from her family, friends, and homeland when she was only a girl of 12. For so many years, she held no hope of seeing her people again. But miraculously, in the last 2 weeks, she had been reunited with both her brother and her childhood friend. But she was a young mother herself now, with her own husband and family. She had a job to do for the Corps of Discovery. Together with Charbonneau and the explorers, she turned towards the west and the unknown lands leading to the Pacific Ocean. How she yearned in her heart to be turning east with the people of her birth. Sacagawea said her farewells to her people. As always, she accepted her future without complaint, as a stream accepts melting snow in spring and cooling rain in the autumn. Seaman stayed close to the horse that Sacagawea rode as the explorers waved goodbye to the Shoshone. He sensed that this trail was steeper for the young Indian woman than for the other explorers. And that ends chapter 9. We'll do chapter 10 tomorrow. Thank you for listening.